I thought it was a love letter. It was an apology. The envelope was waiting on my kitchen table when I got home, placed carefully between the salt shaker and my phone like it had a right to be there. No stamp, no return address, just my name written in his handwriting. Tight, slanted slightly to the right, deliberate. I knew it immediately. I stood there longer than I should have, still wearing my coat, keys in my hand, staring at it like it might move. We hadn't spoken in 3 days. That alone made the letter feel dramatic, almost old-fashioned, and my first thought was that he was trying to be sincere in a way he usually avoided. He hated direct emotional conversations. He preferred gestures, leaving notes, buying things instead of saying things. So a letter tracked. I poured a glass of water before opening it. I don't know why. Some instinct to prepare myself. I sat down, unfolded it carefully, and started reading. The first line didn't say what I expected. It didn't say, I miss you or I love you, or even I'm sorry in the way couples usually mean it. It said, I need to explain something before you hear it from someone else. I remember reading that sentence twice, then once more out loud, like hearing it might change what it meant. My chest tightened in that familiar way, the one that shows up before bad news, but still leaves room for hope. I kept reading. He wrote that he never meant for things to happen the way they did, that it started small, that he thought he could manage it, that he underestimated how quickly things could spiral when people trust you. I stopped there. My hand was shaking enough that the paper made a faint noise, a soft crackle that felt too loud in the quiet apartment. I put the letter down and stared at the wall. For a moment, I convinced myself he was talking about money, or work, or something embarrassing but forgivable. Then I picked it back up. He wrote about late nights, about conversations that crossed lines, about how he told himself it was harmless because it was only words. He wrote that he didn't think it would ever become physical, and when it did, he froze, instead of stopping it. I felt my stomach drop, but not in the way people describe betrayal. It wasn't sharp or explosive, it was heavy, like something sinking slowly and dragging everything else down with it. I remember thinking, this is an apology letter. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't a love letter at all. This was damage control. He didn't use her name at first. He just called her someone who shouldn't have mattered. He said he ended it. He said he was ashamed. He said he loved me and hoped we could talk. I reached the end and realized my glass of water was still untouched. I hadn't blinked in a while. The room felt slightly tilted, like my balance was off. I read it again, slower this time. That's when I noticed what he hadn't said. He never said when it started. He never said how long it lasted. He never said how I might already know. My phone buzzed on the table and I jumped. It wasn't him. It was a message from an unknown number. I'm sorry you're finding out this way, it said. I stared at the screen. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. My hands felt numb as I typed back, asking who it was. There was a pause, then 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. He said he'd tell you. The message finally came through. I didn't know he hadn't yet. My throat felt dry, and I realized I was holding my breath. I asked how she got my number. You gave it to me, she replied. That didn't make sense. I scrolled through my contacts, my message history, my call logs. Nothing. No unfamiliar names, no strange numbers saved. I asked when. Last month, she wrote. At the fundraiser. The fundraiser. I could see it clearly, standing near the bar, juggling a drink in my coat, smiling too much because I was tired. He had introduced me to people all night. Colleagues, friends, acquaintances. Faces blurred together now. I asked her to explain. She sent a photo. It was of the two of us, me and her. We were standing side by side, smiling at the camera. I had my arm around her shoulder. She looked comfortable, familiar, like someone who belonged there. I didn't recognize her at all. The timestamp showed it was taken at 9:42 p.m. I zoomed in on my face, half expecting to see something off, some sign that this wasn't real. But it was me. Same dress, same earrings, same smile I'd practiced in the mirror before leaving that night. You told me he was your brother, she wrote. You said you'd known him forever. I felt cold all over, not confused, certain in a way that didn't require logic yet. I scrolled back to the letter, my eyes landing on a sentence I'd skimmed before. I thought I could keep the parts of my life separate. My phone buzzed again. I didn't know who you were until yesterday, she wrote. He showed me a picture and said you'd understand. The room felt too small. The letter trembled in my hand as something settled into place, slow and awful. This wasn't an apology for betraying me. It was an apology for letting me be part of it. I didn't respond to her message right away. I set my phone face down on the table like it was something hot. The letter was still in my other hand, creased now where my fingers had tightened without me noticing. I read it again, this time not for what it said, but for what it assumed I already knew. The tone wasn't just apologetic. It was cautious, like he was afraid of triggering something. I'd known him for 6 years. We met at a coworker's birthday party, one of those crowded bar situations where everyone pretends to hear each other over music. He stood too close when he talked. I remember that. I remember thinking it was either confidence or nerves. Turned out it was both. We moved in together after a year, not because we had to, but because it felt like the next sensible step. Our life was orderly. Rent paid on time, shared calendars, separate laundry baskets, no big fights, no big declarations either. That fundraiser she mentioned came back to me in pieces. It was for a local arts nonprofit. He was on the planning committee through work. I'd agreed to go last minute, rushed home to change, complained about my shoes the entire drive. I remember him squeezing my hand before we walked in, leaning over to say, "Just smile and let me do the talking tonight." At the time, it felt like relief. I pulled up photos from that night. Group shots, candids, him laughing too hard with people I didn't know, me in the background of one, mid-sip, not really engaged. I zoomed in on faces, trying to spot her. It took a while, but I found her eventually. She was standing behind me in one photo, partially cut off. Same hair as in the picture she sent, same necklace. I still didn't recognize her. I flipped my phone back over and typed, asking where they met. She replied quickly this time. Too quickly, like she'd been waiting. "Through you," she wrote. Technically. That word stuck with me. Technically. She explained that she worked with one of my friends. Not a close friend, but someone I'd known long enough to trust. They'd all gone out for drinks a few times. I might have been there once or twice. She said I'd introduced them, that I'd joked about him being harmless and basically married to his job. I closed my eyes, trying to pull the memory forward. I could picture myself saying something like that. It sounded like me. It sounded like something I'd say without thinking. She told me they started talking more after that. Work events, casual messages. Nothing secret at first. He'd mentioned me often, apparently. Painted me as busy, independent, unbothered. Someone who didn't need much. I felt something twist at that. Not anger yet. Something closer to embarrassment. I asked her when it crossed into something else. She said she wasn't sure. That it felt gradual. That he'd complained about feeling invisible. That she'd listened. That it felt wrong, but also inevitable. The way some things do when no one stops them early. I thought about all the nights I'd gone to bed early while he stayed up working. All the mornings we'd exchanged half sentences over coffee. How often I'd said, "We're good," without checking if that was true. She said he told her I knew, that I was okay with it, that our relationship was open in a way. I stared at that sentence for a long time. We'd never even joked about that. Not once. I told her that wasn't true. There was a long pause. Then she apologized. Not defensively, not dramatically, just a simple, flat apology. She said she felt sick when she realized that she'd confronted him. That's when he'd promised to write me. That's when he'd said I'd understand. I asked her why she contacted me anyway. She said because the photo bothered her, because I looked comfortable, because I didn't look like someone who knew. That night, he came home late. I heard his keys before I heard his voice. He stopped short when he saw me sitting at the table, letter and phone laid out in front of me like evidence. He didn't pretend not to know. That almost made it worse. He sat down across from me without asking. His shoulders were tense. He looked older than he had that morning. "I was going to tell you more," he said. I asked him if I'd ever met her. He hesitated just long enough. "Yes," he said. "But you didn't know." I asked him if I'd ever given her my number. He shook his head. "No, I did." I asked him why she thought I told her he was my brother. He rubbed his face with both hands, dragging them down slowly. "Because I told her that's what you said," he replied. "It was easier." Easier. That word landed wrong. He said he didn't think it mattered, that it was just a cover story, that I was good at making people feel included, that I didn't mind meeting new people, that I wouldn't remember every face anyway. I realized then that he wasn't talking about me like a partner. He was talking about me like a setting, like background noise. I asked him if there were others. He said no too quickly, then corrected himself. "Not like this." I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just felt tired. Deeply, bone-level tired. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to know what else he decided for me without asking. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't about love or temptation or even betrayal in the dramatic sense. This was about control. About how easily my presence had been used to smooth things over. How my assumed flexibility had become permission. Later, after he went to bed, I sat alone and reread the messages from her. I looked again at the photo, at my arm around her shoulder, at my own smile. I tried to remember the conversation, the sound of my voice. Whether I'd laughed, I couldn't. What unsettled me most wasn't that he'd lied to me. It was that he'd been right about something else I hadn't noticed. The next morning, he acted like we were negotiating something temporary. Like this was a rough patch that needed rules and patience, not a fracture that had already set wrong. He made coffee. He asked if I'd slept. He avoided the letter entirely, as if it had served its purpose and could now be retired. I called in sick to work and spent the day doing nothing that felt like rest. Every room in the apartment seemed slightly rearranged, like furniture moved a few inches to the left, subtle enough that you could doubt yourself. I opened drawers and closets, not looking for anything specific, just checking. I don't know what I expected to find. Another letter. Another phone. Another version of my life folded somewhere I hadn't looked. He texted me around noon from the other room. We were both home, separated by a wall. "We should talk tonight," he wrote. I didn't respond. Instead, I messaged her. I asked if we could meet. Not to confront, not to compare notes, just to put a real person to the gap in my memory. She hesitated, then agreed. We picked a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, late afternoon. When I got there, she was already seated, hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking. She stood when she saw me, then stopped, unsure. Up close, she looked younger than I'd imagined. Early 20s maybe. Or maybe just softer in a way I wasn't anymore. We sat. There was an awkward pause where neither of us knew who should speak first. Finally, she said my name out loud, like she was testing it. "I'm sorry," she said again. It sounded practiced, but not fake. I asked her to tell me about the fundraiser. Not what happened between them, just the night itself. Where we stood, who we talked to, what I said. She closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. She said I'd been friendly, that I'd asked about her job, that I'd joked about hating networking events but loving free wine. She said I'd laughed when she spilled a drink and helped her clean it up. Normal things, forgettable things. "And the brother part?" I asked. She frowned. "You didn't say it directly. He did, right after you walked away. He said, 'That's my sister, by the way. She's like that with everyone.'" Something in my chest shifted, not relief, something colder. I asked her if he'd ever told her I was uncomfortable with her. She shook her head. "No, he said you liked me." I stared at her. "He said that?" She nodded. "He said you thought I was good for him, that you'd noticed he was happier lately." I felt a flash of anger then, sharp and clean. Not at her, at the audacity of it, at the confidence it took to invent my approval so casually. She told me more as we sat there. Little things, how he'd used me as a reference point, how he'd say, "You're different from her," then later, "You remind me of her." How he'd frame his distance from me as mutual, intentional, evolved. How he'd say I didn't get jealous, that I trusted him completely. I thought of all the times I'd defended him to friends, all the times I'd said, he wouldn't do that. How that certainty had become part of his story too. Before we left, she asked me something quietly. "Did you ever say yes to this, in any way?" I knew what she meant, not explicitly, not directly. But had I ever smoothed something over, laughed something off, looked away? "I said yes to him," I replied. I didn't realize how much he'd been spending it. That night, back at the apartment, he wanted to talk. He'd rehearsed, I could tell. He framed everything as concern. For me, for us. He said I seemed distant, lately. That I'd been hard to read. That he didn't know how to reach me anymore. I asked him when he started telling people we were open. He blinked. "I never said that exactly." I asked him when he started implying it. He sighed like I was being difficult. "I just didn't correct assumptions." "Whose assumptions?" I asked. "People's," he said. "Yours too, sometimes." That's when I realized what the manipulation actually was. It wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the lies. It was the way he'd made ambiguity do the work for him. How he'd let others fill in gaps he'd carefully created. How he'd let my silence stand in for consent. He told me I was overreacting. That nothing would have happened if I'd been clearer about my needs. That he'd felt unappreciated. That I'd been emotionally unavailable. I asked him why. If that were true, he never said so. He shrugged. "You're not good with confrontation." I almost laughed. Almost. I told him I'd met her. His face tightened. "Why would you do that?" The question wasn't angry. It was genuinely confused, like I'd stepped out of bounds. "I needed to understand," I said. He shook his head. "That's not fair. She doesn't know us." "Neither did you, apparently," I replied. He accused her of exaggerating, of misunderstanding, of being more invested than she should have been. He said she'd misread things, that she was embarrassed and trying to protect herself. I asked him if she was lying about the things he'd said. He didn't answer directly. He said, "You know how people hear what they want to hear." I looked at him then and saw it clearly, not just what he'd done, but how he'd done it. How comfortable he was shifting reality just enough to stay upright. How practiced. Before bed, he told me we didn't need to decide anything right away. That time would help. That we could reset. I went into the bathroom and locked the door. I sat on the edge of the tub and scrolled through my messages again. Through old photos, through years of proof that I'd been present, engaged, real. I wasn't invisible, but I had been convenient. And for the first time since finding the letter, I understood that this wasn't about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about how much of myself I'd have to reclaim to stop this from happening again. The escalation didn't announce itself. There was no single moment where everything tipped. It came in small, practical ways, the kind that would have seemed ordinary a week earlier. He started telling people we were working through things. He told my sister we needed space. He emailed our landlord asking about short-term sublets, just in case. All of it framed as precaution. All of it done without me. I found out because people started asking me how I was holding up. A coworker pulled me aside after a meeting and said she was sorry to hear things were tense at home. A mutual friend texted to say she hoped we were okay and that he'd mentioned I was overwhelmed. My sister called and asked if I was safe. That one stopped me cold. I confronted him that night. I asked him what exactly he'd been telling people. He looked genuinely surprised that I was upset. "I was protecting you," he said again. "You don't like dealing with questions." I told him I didn't like being spoken for. He told me I was being sensitive, that people were worried, that it was better this way. Better for who was the question he never answered. Things with her escalated too, even though he claimed it was over. She messaged me again, hesitant, asking if everything was okay. She said he'd reached out, angry this time, accusing her of stirring things up, of misunderstanding boundaries, of hurting me. He told her I didn't want contact anymore. I hadn't said that. When I told him she'd messaged me, he snapped. It was the first time I'd seen him lose control. His voice rose. He accused me of undermining him, of encouraging drama, of refusing to let things settle. "You don't need her perspective," he said. "You have mine." That sentence stayed with me. I started paying closer attention. Not just to what he said, but to when he said it. How often he positioned himself as the interpreter of events. How quickly he reframed anything that challenged him as confusion, emotion, miscommunication. How he'd pause just long enough before answering hard questions, like he was selecting from options. One afternoon, while he was out, I logged into our shared cloud account. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Emails maybe, photos, something concrete. I found calendar entries I didn't recognize, meetings that didn't exist, blocks of time labeled vaguely. Check-in. Dinner. Always during hours he'd said he was working late. I cross-referenced dates, messages, photos, the fundraiser. Other nights. Patterns emerged. Not just with her. With other names I didn't recognize at first. Then slowly did. People I'd met. People I'd been friendly with. People he'd decided were safe. When I asked him about it, he said I was invading his privacy. I asked him why his privacy required my erasure. He told me I was spiraling. That was the word he chose. Spiraling. As if this were a loss of control on my part, not the inevitable result of finally seeing too much at once. He suggested counseling, but only if it was framed as communication issues. He said we didn't need to dredge up the past. He said intentions mattered more than details. He said he loved me. But love, I was realizing, had been used like a credential. A way to bypass accountability. A way to ask for trust without offering transparency. The escalation became public when someone forwarded me a message he'd sent in a group chat I wasn't in. He joked about being between places emotionally, about how long-term relationships change shape, about how I was strong and understanding. Reading my own personality traits repurposed as justification made my hands shake. That night, I packed a bag, not dramatically, just enough for a few days. When he saw it, he asked where I was going. "I need room to think," I said. He nodded, too quickly. "That's probably for the best." As I walked out, he added, "Don't let other people get in your head." I didn't respond. What I understood then was that escalation wasn't about more betrayal. It was about consolidation, about him tightening his version of events before mine could harden into something solid. And for the first time, I saw how much effort he'd been putting into managing the story, which meant there was something he still didn't want seen. I stayed at my sister's place for 3 nights. She didn't ask many questions, which I appreciated. She let me sleep late, let me sit in silence at the kitchen table, let me answer work emails like nothing was wrong. On the 4th morning, she went out for groceries, and I was alone in the apartment, scrolling absently through my phone when a notification popped up from the shared cloud account. It was a login alert. Someone had accessed it from his laptop. I don't know why that was the moment something hardened in me. Maybe because he'd accused me of invading his privacy, yet he was still comfortable using shared systems like they were his alone. Or maybe because I realized he assumed I'd stop looking, that I'd retreat into doubt and let him handle things. I opened the account. He hadn't deleted anything. That surprised me at first. Then it didn't. He didn't think he needed to. He believed context could always be adjusted later. That meaning was flexible. I went deeper than before, past the calendar, past photos, into archived folders, old backups, files synced automatically from apps he probably forgot existed. There were message threads saved as PDFs, not just with her, with others. Some brief, some long, some overlapping. The language was consistent across all of them. The same phrases, the same reassurances, the same framing of me. She knows. She's fine with it. We've talked about this. She trusts me. In one thread, someone asked directly if I was okay with it. He'd replied, "She suggested it, actually. She doesn't believe in ownership." I felt something close to nausea reading that. Not because it misrepresented me, though it did, but because it used a version of me I recognized. A flattened one. A quote taken out of a larger, more careful conversation and repurposed into permission. Then I found the audio. It was a voice memo, mislabeled, buried in a folder of work notes. Nearly an hour long. The date made my stomach tighten. It was from the night of the fundraiser. I put in headphones before pressing play. At first, it was just ambient noise, music, voices. Then his voice, clearer, laughing, talking, and then mine. I was stunned by how normal it sounded. I was animated, engaged. I was talking about the event, about how exhausting it was to keep track of people's names. I joked about him flirting for charity donations. He laughed. Then there was a pause. Someone asked a question. I recognized her voice now, even before she said her name. She asked, half joking, if I ever got jealous. I heard myself respond without hesitation. "No," I said. "If I had to police him, I wouldn't be with him." The words hit me harder than anything else I'd seen, because they were mine. What followed made the context unmistakable. He jumped in immediately, expanding on it, interpreting. "She's always been like that," he said. "Very evolved." I remembered that moment then, or parts of it. I remembered saying something casual, something meant to shut down a silly question in a noisy room. I remembered trusting that he understood the difference between trust and indifference. He didn't correct it, he amplified it. The recording continued. Later in the night, after I'd wandered off, his tone shifted. Quieter, more intimate. He talked about feeling constrained, about being seen but not desired, about how long-term relationships required creativity. I stopped the recording before it ended. I sat there for a long time, headphones still on, listening to nothing. My reflection in the dark screen of my phone looked unfamiliar, not broken, just altered. Like someone who'd been speaking a language fluently without realizing someone else was translating it for their own use. This was the proof. Not because it showed infidelity, I already knew that, but because it showed intent, pattern, method. It showed how he'd built a case over time, collecting moments, phrases, offhand comments, then arranging them into something that served him. He hadn't misunderstood me. He'd studied me. When I confronted him that night, I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I told him what I'd found. His reaction was immediate and telling. He didn't deny it. He didn't ask how I'd access the files. He went straight to minimizing. "That's not what it sounds like," he said. I told him I wasn't asking what it sounded like. I told him I'd heard my own voice. He tried to explain it away. Context, pressure, social dynamics. He said I was taking things too literally, that people exaggerate at events like that. That nothing he said was technically false. That word again, technically. I played part of the recording out loud, just a few seconds, my voice saying no, his voice following it. He went quiet. For the first time since this began, he looked uncertain. Not guilty, cornered. "You recorded that," I said. "You kept it." He shrugged. "I keep lots of things." "Why?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "I didn't know I'd need it." That was it. That was the moment any remaining ambiguity died. Because proof isn't just evidence of what happened. It's evidence of preparation, of foresight, of someone anticipating a need to justify themselves later. I told him I was done talking. He asked if we could revisit this after some time. I told him there was nothing left to revisit. When I left, I didn't take much. Just essentials. Documents, clothes, my laptop. He stood in the doorway and watched me, silent. The proof stayed with me, not as leverage, not as something to show others, but as an anchor. A fixed point I could return to when doubt crept in. When his voice tried to overwrite mine again in my head. This wasn't confusion. This was design. The emotional fallout didn't come all at once. It came in waves that didn't follow logic. One moment I felt steady, almost clear. The next, I'd be undone by something small. An email notification, a familiar street, the smell of his soap on a sweater I'd forgotten to leave behind. At my sister's place, I slept in short bursts. I'd wake up convinced imagined parts of it, that I'd exaggerated his intent, that I'd taken a few bad moments and turned them into a story too heavy to carry. Then I'd remember the recording. His voice. The way he said I was evolved. The way he'd said he didn't know he'd need it. That memory functioned like a reset button. What surprised me most was the grief. Not just for the relationship, but for the version of myself I'd been while in it. The one who trusted tone over content. The one who believed that being easygoing made things safer. I mourned her quietly, without ceremony. He texted me twice. The first message was restrained. He said he hoped I was okay, that he was giving me space. The second came 2 days later, longer, more emotional. He said he missed me, that he felt misunderstood, that none of this reflected how he truly felt about me. I didn't reply. Instead, I started writing things down. Not a journal exactly, more like an inventory. What I remembered saying, what I hadn't, what I'd assumed versus what I'd verified. It wasn't about blame, it was about regaining authorship. There were moments of anger, sharp and focused, but they passed quickly, replaced by something heavier, a kind of sadness that came from recognizing how little resistance he'd encountered, how smoothly my personality had been folded into his explanations, how rarely I'd checked the difference between being trusting and being absent. Friends reached out, some awkwardly, some carefully. I noticed how often people asked what I was going to do, as if the next step might resolve the discomfort of knowing. I didn't have an answer for them. I barely had one for myself. What I did have was a growing sense of separation, not just from him, but from the noise he'd created around me. The explanations, the reframing, the constant suggestion that clarity was optional. One evening alone, I played the recording again. Just my voice this time. The way I sounded sure, present. I listened until I could hear myself without flinching. I realized then that the worst part wasn't that he'd betrayed me. It was that, for a while, he'd made me doubt whether I was allowed to be angry about it. That doubt lingered longer than I expected. But it didn't stay. The first external consequence came from work. My manager asked to check in, casually at first, then more pointedly. She said she'd heard I was going through something personal and wanted to make sure it wasn't affecting deadlines. She said my partner had mentioned I'd been overwhelmed lately. Partner. Present tense. I corrected her, briefly. I said we'd separated. Her expression shifted. Not surprise, more like recalibration. She apologized and moved on, but the damage was done. I'd been discussed, positioned, preempted. It happened again with friends. A couple we'd known together invited me to coffee. They asked careful questions, framed with concern. He told them we were taking time apart to reset communication. He told them I needed space and might be sensitive. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't before. Not because people knew something was wrong, but because they thought they already understood it. I started clarifying, gently at first, then more directly. Not with details, not with proof, just with boundaries. That's not accurate. I didn't agree to that. Please don't relay messages. Each correction felt like reclaiming a square inch of ground. He noticed. He sent a message asking why people were suddenly being cold with him. He said it felt like I was turning them against him. He said he thought we'd agreed to keep things private. I told him we hadn't agreed to anything. I told him I was correcting misinformation. He replied that intent mattered, that I was hurting him unnecessarily, that people didn't need to know specifics. I didn't respond. The most tangible consequence came a week later, when his work contacted me. There'd been a complaint. Not from me, from someone else. One of the women whose messages I'd seen. She'd forwarded screenshots, context, dates, his framing of consent. They were conducting an internal review. I wasn't asked to participate, but my name came up anyway. As confirmation, as character reference, as implied cosigner. I declined to comment. That decision felt important. Not out of spite, but because I understood now how easily my voice could be used to stabilize his version of events. Silence, in this case, was accuracy. He showed up at my sister's place unannounced after that. He looked shaken, smaller. He said things were getting out of hand, that people were misinterpreting, that I could help clear it up. I told him I wouldn't. He asked if I wanted him to lose everything. I said, I don't want to manage the consequences of your choices. That was the first time I saw him cry. Real tears, no words, just the physical response. It didn't move me the way it once would have. Because by then, the external world had started responding not to his explanations, but to the pattern itself. The repetition, the overlap, the way he treated truth as flexible depending on audience. And for the first time, I wasn't positioned at the center of it. Buffering, smoothing, translating. I was outside, watching accountability, imperfect and uneven, finally catch up. And realizing that stepping back wasn't abandonment. It was release. Once the external noise died down, what remained was internal and harder to manage. There were no messages to respond to, no rumors to correct, no logistics to handle. Just time, long stretches of it. That's when the psychological impact set in. I started noticing how often I questioned myself over small things, what I'd meant in a conversation, whether my tone had been clear, if I'd overreacted to something harmless. It wasn't constant, but it was persistent, like a low-grade static. I'd catch myself rehearsing explanations no one had asked for. I realized how deeply I'd absorbed the idea that clarity was negotiable, that being understood was less important than being agreeable. I'd internalized his way of smoothing edges, of keeping things ambiguous enough that nothing ever fully landed. I thought about the recording again, not the content this time, but my response to hearing it. How shocking it had been to hear my own certainty, the ease in my voice. That version of me hadn't disappeared. She'd just been talked over long enough that I'd started doing it myself. I began pulling moments apart, one by one, not to punish myself, but to understand. When had I gone quiet instead of asking a follow-up? When had I accepted "it's nothing" as an answer? When had I mistaken calm for honesty? There was grief in that process, but also something else. Relief. Because the pattern wasn't random, it had a shape. And if it had a shape, it could be recognized again. I started therapy, though I didn't tell many people, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted the space to be just mine. The sessions weren't dramatic. Mostly they involved me describing events and being asked simple questions in return. What did you feel then? What did you want to say? What stopped you? Often the answer was habit. I'd built an identity around being reasonable, flexible, hard to offend. It had served me well in many contexts, but in that relationship, it had been quietly repurposed, used as evidence that I didn't need clarity, that I wouldn't mind. One afternoon, weeks later, I caught myself laughing out loud alone in my car. Not hysterically, just surprised. I'd disagreed with someone at work, clearly, calmly, and the world hadn't ended. No one had reframed it. No one had corrected me. That moment stayed with me. The psychological shift wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like empowerment. It felt like reorientation, like learning to stand without leaning slightly towards someone else's version of events. I still had moments of doubt, still replayed conversations, but now, when his voice surfaced in my head, offering explanations I hadn't asked for, it didn't stay long. It no longer sounded like authority, it sounded like a habit I was finally breaking. The permanent decision came without ceremony, no confrontation, no dramatic last conversation. It arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was standing in line for coffee, scrolling through my phone, when I saw his name pop up again. He hadn't texted in weeks. This time the message was simple. Can we talk? I think enough time has passed. I read it once, then again. I noticed how neutral it sounded. How reasonable. How it positioned time itself as a solvent, something that naturally dissolved responsibility. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel tempted. I felt clear. I typed a response and deleted it twice before sending the third version. No. Please don't contact me again. There was a pause. Then 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. I think you're making a mistake, he wrote. We didn't get closure. That word, closure, used to work on me. It implied maturity, completeness. The idea that something unfinished was inherently unstable. But I understood something then that I hadn't before. Closure wasn't something he was owed, it was something he used to reopen doors. I blocked his number. I didn't announce it to anyone. I didn't mark the moment. I just stood there with my coffee when it was handed to me, surprised by how normal everything looked afterward. Cars moved, people talked. Nothing shifted except me. Later that week, I signed a new lease. A small place. Quiet. No shared history. I bought a cheap table and assembled it myself, crooked legs and all. I liked that no one corrected it. There were moments of sadness, yes. Of course there were. Permanence always carries weight. But beneath that was something steadier. Sense that I'd exited a room I didn't realize I'd been shrinking inside. The decision wasn't about punishing him. It wasn't even about justice. It was about refusing to participate in a dynamic that required my distortion to function. I stopped wondering if I'd been too harsh. I stopped replaying alternatives. I stopped asking whether he might finally understand. Understanding wasn't the point. The point was that I did. And once I made that decision, fully, without contingency, I felt something settle into place. Not happiness, alignment. The first weeks after I left were a strange mix of relief and disorientation. I kept expecting him to appear at the apartment, or for a message to pop up, or for someone to casually drop a reminder that I hadn't accounted for. None of it happened. The silence felt almost unnatural at first, like holding your breath in a room that refuses to acknowledge you. I unpacked slowly, placing each item where it made sense to me, without concern for anyone else's preferences or expectations. I bought a small plant, one that didn't need much light, and placed it on the windowsill. I watered it daily, not because it was symbolic, but because I liked the routine. It reminded me that I could care for something without compromise or interference. Work became an anchor. My colleagues treated me normally, and I treated myself normally, though I had an internal checklist I followed silently. Was I speaking for myself? Did I clarify when assumptions were made? Did I let people define my narrative? Sometimes I faltered, but the awareness was enough to stop the patterns from repeating. Friends came around more, cautiously at first, but they eventually understood that my distance hadn't been avoidance, it had been recalibration. People I hadn't realized I'd been leaning on for validation showed up in small, practical ways: a lunch invitation, a message checking in, an offer to help move a box or two. I realized that, while one person had tried to shape my life for their convenience, many others respected me enough to let me be the author of it. I didn't speak to him again. His presence receded slowly from my mind, not with dramatic closure, but with the simple fact that he no longer had access to my space, my time, or my voice. I stopped replaying conversations, stopped dissecting what he'd meant by certain phrases, stopped questioning whether I'd missed a sign. That part of my life had folded into memory, complete and untouchable. Sometimes I still think about the recording, the letters, the manipulation, not with fear or anger, but as evidence of how close I'd come to letting someone else define reality for me. I use it as a reminder. Clarity matters. Boundaries matter. My voice matters. The apartment, the coffee, the small routines, all of it became my quiet proof that I existed on my own terms. And for the first time in a long time, I felt entirely present in my own story.